Hey there, sculptors. Welcome back to the studio. We're going to begin sort of filling in the trunk of our armatures today by connecting the chest block and the pelvis block. Today, if you kind of have gotten out of this habit, I want you to keep your reference materials pretty close by. I'm going to be working again with the Rodin sculptural sketch. There are, 3 of these images: a front, side, and a back, or about a front and 3/4 back. That's pretty good for a sculptural reference. He's missing a lot of what I might call the information on these pieces, and so they're not quite as stressful to work on. What I mean by information is like musculature, a lot of surface detail, but what's here is the pose, what's here is an accurate scale, and what's here are pretty good information on the sort of tapering of the limbs, the kind of shape of the trunk of the body. So this is where I really want to put our emphasis over the next few days with this piece. We're going to be keeping your anatomical drawings, anatomical references pretty close by, even though a lot of the pose and the sort of surface information is going to come from our reference photographs. Most of what we're doing today is still going to be coming from our anatomical guide. The sort of width of the shoulders, the narrowing of the waist, and then the broadening of the hips. Again, this is where we're going to put our energy. The last thing I just want to mention briefly is a couple of books that I've got in the studio available for you guys to take a look at. Since this is really a study of anatomy, artists are just as interested, at least artists who are working on figure sculpture, just as interested in anatomy as you might expect, say, a biologist or a physician, somebody who's studying the body for medical reasons. We've got a few different anatomy texts. Many of them are specifically geared toward drawing the body, but work really, really well for sculpting. This particular one, Anatomy for the Artist, it's by Yano Barcet. He teaches anatomy, or at least he was teaching anatomy in a museum or at an art school. I believe it was in Belgium, not sure. He published this book in the 50s. This one is a reprint from 2000s, but really, really excellent information on the inside. Say, for example, the sort of scale and arrangement of the bone structures in the hips, right? If you sort of had a hard time visualizing maybe that insertion, right, of where the armature was going to take a bend and go down, this is that sort of ball and socket hip joint that I kept referencing. Very soon, right, we're going to be talking a bit more about musculature, right, and why on the surface we see all this kind of undulating information, right? It's got to do with the musculature that's just underneath the surface, and so we'll reference some of this stuff. And if you want to bring a lot more realism and detail into your pieces, I'll have this book available for you. Finally, today in particular, we'll be taking a little bit more intimate look at the trunk and the chest cavity, what occasionally here sculptors refer to as the egg, right? The egg would be the rib cage, and then so far we're keeping our armature just inside our kind of fleshy clay work inside of our outer contours. Eventually, we'll jump outside of the rib cage and then match our clay to some of that sort of outer contour work. And that's really where we're going to need the kind of front, side, and back view of your subject, because we're going to need all of that information. I've got Yano's book in the studio for you guys to take a look at. I can also maybe photograph and then share with you some of the details so that you have that as sculptural reference as well. And you're welcome to take a look at some of the other texts that we have in the art library. What I would like for you guys to do is work along with me. I'm going to put in maybe 25 or 30 minutes worth of work today on this guy. I'm going to get my camera repositioned, and you'll join me again for a little bit of sculpting. So as we begin working with the clay, do your best to work at about eye level or so. Either bring your chair down low enough, or bring your piece up high enough that you can be working at about eye level. Keep your reference materials close by, and I'm always kind of working with a bit of clay warming up in my one hand, and then my other hand is sort of applying the small dabs. We'll start today by filling in the sort of gap, or the right along the spine, where I know I need the trunk to come together, where the sort of chest box and the pelvis box are going to join. as this all happens, I'm going to do my best to sort of follow some of the muscular sort of pathways that might move to join the rib cage to the hips. There's a lot of really interesting abs that are going on there that will help us give form to them, but just a lot of the sort of connector tissue that runs down the side of our character here, that's going to be useful stuff to either take a look at in the anatomy text or just pay really, really close attention to your anatomical guides. Now, so far, it may look like I'm just kind of doing a bit of guessing here and just kind of throwing clay on, but what I'm doing is I'm sort of massing in areas that I know for sure I'm going to need to fill, and I know that I'm really nowhere near the sort of limits of my form. I will, though, be taking into consideration some measurements here very soon. I will take a measurement of his waist at about the navel, and then be checking against that waist, and double checking and make sure that I'm still working well within the limits of the outer area. And it's also not a bad idea for me to occasionally mark important areas, like I do need to keep track of where that navel is, and I do need to keep track of where that line is that sort of travels down through the center of my subject. And if I've been adding too much clay on one side or the other of that line, I need to compensate for it. My anatomical guide and my reference is a very symmetrical form. There's the same amount of mass on either side, and so I need to be careful to do that. Now, I'm also going to be taking some measurements of the sort of thickness front to back of the waist. Right about at the navel is not a bad place to take that measurement, and I still have quite a bit of clay to build out, probably in the front, underneath the rib cage. In the back, I've done just a bit more developing, but still pretty skinny in the waist. I'm doing that because remember, I don't want to do any of the outer contour details quite yet. I'm saving all of that detail work for later. You notice that as I roll out small bits of clay here, I'm usually rolling them out to be long so that they follow the contours of the body, and then also they sort of taper off at either end. So I'm adding a bit of clay in the middle, but then always kind of tapering that clay into the other areas. That sort of blending is going to help you keep tabs of your character as a whole, right? You're never just working on one part by itself, always kind of considering how it's building out, how it's kind of massing in relation to the other areas of the body. And by always kind of tapering out my coils, I'm always end up having to blend them into the armpit a little bit, or maybe blend it into the hips a little bit. I find that to be sort of a good way to keep track of where the clay is going and how parts are starting to relate to each other. So I've done a fair bit of massing here in the waist, and I've had to add little bits and pieces here and there along the way just to make sure that my measurements are accurate. And I still, I have some work to do back here. I'm still missing some girth and some musculature underneath my upper arm, and that'll come. But what I want to kind of start to do here at the end of this tutorial, and really it's kind of a lead-in for the next tutorial, is begin just to kind of start suggesting, right, that he's more than just a torso, right? Just kind of begin packing in a bit of clay in the arms, just to kind of offer us a platform to build off on. So I'm basically wrapped up for today's session. For this tutorial session, I've got the beginnings of my limbs, just sort of a reference on where the limbs will sort of leave the torso. I still have a little bit of work to do on the torso, but I don't want to get so far refined on the torso before I at least have some of the limbs blocked in. In the next tutorial, we'll start to talk a little bit more about following a particular contour. Contours would be the sort of most exterior information, the kind of detail that is on the surface of the skin. And so we'll kind of keep in mind some of these structural concerns. I don't want to get too focused on surface information if I don't yet have my forms in place, but it is about time to start talking about, as I'm adding that material and I'm taking measurements and I'm getting very, very close to the surface of the skin, we'll start to kind of follow curves in the round here. For each curve, each sort of position, side view, back view, is going to have a line that we'll focus on, and we'll try our best to stay true to our sculptural references and to our anatomical guides, guys. I'm excited to see where you're at with these in the studio. I look forward to giving you some pointers here and there, and you guys can show me a little bit about what you've completed. Take it easy, guys. Catch you up in the studio.